Let's get started with the project creation. I have the Visual Studio open in my system. What I'll do is I'll create a new .NET Core web application, and let's call the application as simple Json Converter. So with this, I'll select the API template that the .NET Core 2.2 provides. I'll click on OK, and in a few seconds my project will be ready and we will go through it in my Solution Explorer. There it is. So as you can see, it comes with the default controller method. What I'll do is I'll go and delete this method straight away, and I'll create a simple controller here. Let's call it as, I'll create the API controller here and let's call it as person controller. This will take a few seconds to get completed. So after that, I'm going to add the models, and then we will see how the API will be called from my Postman service. So there it is, the person controller is all ready. What I'll do is I'll go ahead and create a sample get method. And let's declare the method action result. Let's call the method as post person details. I'll go into the details of how the person object will be created, but we're just creating a stub here, so no need to worry. Let's call it as a person object and person. Now let's focus towards creation of the models. What I'll do is I'll create a new folder here. Let's call it models, and I will go ahead and create a few classes here. So as during the introduction of this session, I was mentioning that we are going to cover like how the inheritance scenario is covered along with, we're using the JSON converter. So I'll create a person class at first, and I'll create some properties, like simple properties like public, string, name, get, set, and along with it I'll create a few more properties like gender and daytime type, as in date of birth. Right. So along with this model, I want to divide my person. I want to inherit my person class into two different classes. Let's call the first one as teacher, and I want to inherit from the person class. So I'll just add one property, simple property to it, so that it's we will keep it easy and simple. The property that I'll add is the int, and let's call the property as tenure. So we have the teacher class defined. Now let's move over to the student class, student, and let's have another property here, just one property, which will be the int type, and let's call that property as grade. Now let's go back to the person controller method here and remove these errors. Simple yes, and what I'll do is I'll return the object itself, the person object itself, back as response. Let's change it to HTTP post. That makes it better. Now I'll go back to the Postman app here, and what I'll do is I'll create the body here. I wanted it raw and JSON format. As you remember, we have a few properties which are there in the person object, and I'll try to just mimic those here in the request. Let's call it as unmatched. Let's put the gender as male. Let's launch the project here and use this particular project to respond to that. So as you see that we have the endpoint here, and we will go here and paste it in the URL, and I'll trigger the request. Okay, let's change it to post. So as you can see, we have the same object which came back. The data object, since it's not nullable type, we can add it back here so that everything looks just the same. Let's change the date to 1990-01, something like 06 and 8. So 6th of August 1990. Now send the request, and we get the similar response back. So as you can see, the person objects works fairly well. Now in the next phase of this project, what I want to do is we have a teacher type here, right? If you can see in the teacher type, and then we have a student type model here, which will be used to enter the student type records, and then this teacher type will be used to enter this teacher type records. So I want to make this API dynamic in the way that it should be able to handle both the objects. So if I have to like, the ideal way of doing it is like without the JSON converter would be to define two different methods. One will be post teacher details, and there will be another method as post student details, and then you will send respective objects into it. But JSON converters like enable us, they help us in achieving this dynamic deserialization, which will help us in reducing the number of lines of code that we write in the end. So in this simple example, we only have two types of objects, like two types of child objects, but in a real life scenario where you have 10 or 20 types of different child objects, it is actually difficult to maintain 20 different methods. So this is where JSON converters come in handy, and I'll show you how it is done. So let's begin with modifying the person class here. So what I will do here is add another string type property. Let's call it as person type, which will generally have the string as if it's a student or it's a teacher, and that's the only indicator for the person type object. Set. So let's go and create a few constants first, because that's what we will be filling in into this person type class. Let's call it constants. Let's make it a static class. So I'll start with adding two constants here, one each for teacher and student. Teacher, and let's add another one for student. Now it's done for the JSON converter. So let's add a folder called converters, and I'll start with adding a class. Let's call it Json type converter. In this class, I will inherit the Json converter, which comes from the Newtonsoft.json, and let's just typecast this to a T type, generate type T, and I will implement the abstract methods. As you can see, by default, JSON converter, when you inherit from the JSON converter, it asks you to inherit override three methods, which is can convert, read JSON, and write JSON. So let's just make changes to to each one of them one by one. So for can convert, this method is basically asking you that if it can use the JSON convert to or just JSON convert class to convert the incoming JSON type. So let's keep it dynamic in its nature. So let's use the type of method to see that okay, if the type T that is incoming is assignable from object type. So that makes it very easy for the method to see if the object type can be assignable from type T, then it should go ahead and just use the class for any of the JSON conversions. And for the read JSON part, let's have some safety measures first. Let's say that reader dot token type equal to let's use the JSON token type dot null. Then it should return null by default, and if not, if it passes that, then use the object type object equals to object dot load, and it should load from the reader itself. Then we have the target type, which is the end object or the child object in this case, that it should be created from certain parameters that we'll pass on to. Let's create a stub then. Create. Let's use public abstract, since it's abstract method, and we will be using it in our actual converter, the base converter class. So let's create the abstract type here, and we will implement that in our base class. The output type will be type T, and let's use the create method, and the input will be type object type, and then the J object. That is good. Let's define it as an abstract class, and let's just pass on these properties to the object as object type, and another one would be the J object. So after that, what we'll do is we'll use the serializer object which was passed into the readJSON method to populate the values into the newly formed object, which is target. So this is a child class which we want to populate the values into. So let's just use the J object dot create reader, which will read the entire JSON, and we will put it into the target. So, and let's return the target object from this method. So since we created this abstract method here, we need to create one more class where we will implement this create method. So let's go ahead and create another class, and let's call it as person converter. and we will implement from the JSON type converter, and let's give the type as person, type as person. Right. So it will ask us to implement the abstract class, which is the create method that we created there. The idea of this class is to get the value, to determine which object it is. So we will use this person type property to distinguish between different classes, and then we will assign the right class or the respective class. We will generate a new object for that particular class type. So the first line would be to get that value. So person type equal to j object dot value, which should be in a string, and the input to that would be the same. So notice, it's actually, we have changed it from snake case to camel case, or correct, pardon me, from Pascal case to camel case, because that's how the JSON is serialized by default. So the p will be small in this case, and let's put a switch case here, and person type. So we'll go by one by one to the constants that we created. So if it's a teacher type dot teacher, then we will return a new instance of teacher, and if it's constants dot student, then we will return a new instance of the student type. Student, and by default we will return the basic person type that we already have. Right. So let's use this. Let's implement inherit it from the person class that we missed in the beginning, and as you can see, the error goes away with that. Right. So now that we have most of the things in place, I just wanted to run down what will be the flow in the theory. So what happens is, whenever we make a request to this particular endpoint, so this person class will now go to the, so whenever it's us, so we have the JSON string, which is actually a string which is coming as part of the request. We have to deserialize it into an object. So that's where we have to mention that what's the deserializer that we will be using here on the person one. So we have an attribute here which will make it easier for the whole application to use the JSON converter that we have defined just now. So to do that, what we'll do is JSON converter, and you will say that the type of JSON converter that we want to use here is the person converter that we just created. So what it will happen is, it will go to the person converter, and it will start with this can convert. If it can convert it, the incoming JSON into a object type, and if it's a student, or if it's a person type, or if it's a teacher type, it will return true, and then it will come to this read JSON method. So there's one more method that we should talk about, is the write JSON. So in our example, as you can see that we haven't implemented it yet. The reason is write JSON is basically not used much because we are not deriving values from the JSON, or we are not creating a new JSON here from the existing values. So to skip this method, you have to override one more method from the JSON converter class, which is override. Let's just do that here and show you. Boolean, and that will be can write method. So what it basically does is, it will just give you that uh, statement that it should not use the right method. So what we'll do is we will use the get property and we will return false by default all the time. There it is. So with this property set, with this method like being overridden, what we'll do is it will always return false. So we will never come into the write JSON method. Now that is said, let's just discuss further about it. So what we'll do is it will create the target. So here's the method. Let me start from the beginning. So it will come into this method, and the token type is not null in this case because we will be having like some input to it, and we'll come to the JSON object, read from the reader, which is the request here, and it will create its own J object, and then it will go to this method, the abstract method that we just created in the person converter. It will try to read from the person type property, which will be part of the J object, and it will determine that which is the parameter, which object it should create. So it will create that object here with the target reference, and then we will use the serialize or populate method to read the complete J object and put it into a target. So with that done, what will happen is the person is now no more a person reference anymore. It will be having its respective student or teacher reference. So let's get started with launching the project and let's give it a try and see if we have missed anything or if it's gonna work completely fine. So here I am going to add one more property here. Let's call it person type, and let's keep the property as student, and let's go back to the project. Let's see which. So the student has like a different property from the teacher, as it has a grade property. Let's go back here and let's just add the property here and see if it works. Great. Since it's an int property, let's keep it as 10 and let's send the request. So as you can see, it's able to decipher that okay, it's a student type, and it gives out a respective response with the student and 10 as the grade. Now if you change it to teacher, what will happen is even if you send the grade as 10, it's still like it converted into a teacher object based on the person type property, and there you go, like the tenure is set to 0 because that's an int and the default value is 0. Now if I change it to 5, right, and I change this to a tenure property and I send the request, so what happens is now the tenure is filled and based on the person type as teacher. So if you can allow me to put a breakpoint here, so I'll just like walk you down the object that is getting created even before like we enter the this particular the first line of the code. Let's just send a request. So what basically happens is now the person, right, as you can see, it's a model.teacher. So even if we were expecting a person type here, it has deserialized it into a teacher type object, and this will be helpful if you have, as I said, you have different types of properties, different types of child classes to which you have to deserialize because you need to have dynamic deserialization from the parent. So that's all for this demo. Hopefully this session was helpful in understanding the JSON converter and also provided you some help in terms of implementing it. So thank you for watching. Do like, comment and subscribe if you feel like. Bye.